Okay, let's talk about some of the most annoying aspects of owning a C4S4 or UrS4. Generally speaking, these are really good cars. They were well built, decent materials, etc. But there are a few, let's just say, team door handle issues. So those of you that have been into Audis for a long time remember the old squeeze door handles and how, especially in the northern climates, they were not the robust things that we hoped they were. So with that said, we're going to look at some of the team door handle applications that are still on the S4. Now, this is probably the biggest annoyance for me on these cars. Audi engineered these with basically plastic gnat arms, like GNAT, gnat. They are absolutely, I mean, you can breathe on this thing sideways and it'll fall out. So it's real common to have these broken, and this doesn't want to fit in here. This is kind of the most afterthought part of the car, and it's honestly one of my most hated aspects of the S4. So it's got two metal tabs on the sides and the front here that hold it up, and then two little plastic arms that hook in on the back. So to remove it, you bring the sides down here first and then carefully bring it forward and down. Otherwise, if you pull here, snap, snap, you just broke the little arms off of that, and good luck. You're gonna have to re-engineer them. So the other problem is, no matter what it is, you have this little fit and finish issue. I've seen very few cars where they're just perfect and untouched, but it is what it is. That's probably one of the single most annoying things on these cars. The next area we're going to look at would be the screw at the top of the doors where they mount to the body. And you can see this one is still intact. But if you go to the front doors, they are almost always broken for some reason. It's just a thin little spot with a hole right there. It just wasn't meant to be for long-term longevity anyway. So as these cars age, these rear trunk stops are very prone. They're just kind of a rubberized coating, but they're riveted to the body. So you have that side of it there, and then of course you have this side up on the trunk lid itself. And these are very prone to being in bits, as well as these little moldings in the body as well. So there's one of these on each side, as well as the trunk stops on each side. Same with that plug there. These are all prone to basically disintegrating over time. So next up, we're going to talk carbon fiber. And this is the 1993 models, or honestly, a lot of the cars have had them transplanted into later models or earlier models. But the clear coating on the carbon fiber has a tendency to crack with age. And you can see here in the red car, I've got that one little crack on the passenger door. Aside from that, it's actually really good in this car. But I don't know whether or not this works or not, but I can say that the thing that I've been doing over the years is to actually wax these. So when I would typically use Vinyl X for the vinyl and Lexol for the leather, and then I would use Mother's synthetic wax as a coating over the carbon fiber. And I don't know if that has been the key to success in this particular car, but I would use something like a ceramic coating perhaps on top of this, get it really clean. Something that has UV protection would be good, but the key is, at least in my case, was to wax it and keep it from drying out. And obviously don't park it in the sunlight as best you can. That's the number one thing that helps. So carbon fiber. The wood trim, by the way, is not nearly as susceptible to the cracking for some reason. And I think part of it may be the color. I mean, the heat, obviously, if you get black in sunshine, it gets warmer than a lighter color, so maybe that has something to do with it, or it's just the clear epoxy or whatever they use to coat these at the factory just doesn't hold up as well. Next up, we're talking interior light bulbs. That can be anything from instrument cluster, which these are still working and at some point have been upgraded. But the bulbs, typical things like behind the heated seat, I see this one is out. Even to the climate control display bulbs. And actually, in honesty, these are actually very easy to replace. You can get a plastic pry bar and take off this face. And then there's just a couple of nuts that hold that in. You can slide it out, unplug it, and the bulbs actually just half twist in. They're very simple to replace if you can find the bulbs. I'll try to see if I can put a link for a source for the bulbs for these. But the instrument cluster is very similar. There's two, let's see, there's one right here where my finger is. There's a hole there, and there's another hole right above the ignition switch over here. And there are, I think, 2 bolts or screws under there. So you take that out carefully. There's a pin on this end that helps align that. And then it will lift out from this side, pull it out, and then you'll be able to access the fasteners for the instrument cluster. Once you do that, you're going to have several connections. Back here, you're going to have to unplug, and also back here if you want to take it all the way out. I've found in some cases, depending on where your bulbs are burned out, you can actually just sort of sneak it out this way. I will caution you though, put a towel down over the top of this or tape this up so that there are metal tabs on the bottom of the cluster where the bolts go through, and you will scratch the top of your steering wheel cowl cover here if you don't protect it. So I usually wrap a microfiber towel around it, tape it around there so it's not going to go anywhere, and then I'm just very conscious of when I pull that out where all those tabs are so I don't scratch anything else. But it's really not that hard to do. It may seem a little daunting, but if you're very careful and take your time releasing the plugs, you can very easily change the bulbs in that cluster. And you can actually do the bulb upgrade in these as well to make it brighter. I know some people have talked about LEDs. I'm still a fan of using the factory spec bulbs and everything, just because because I know it works. It's worked for many, many years, and I don't have any weird, voltage issues or anything. And yeah, so that's all good. Instrument cluster, I do those periodically as well. And the switch is here. Now, if you're good with electronics and can do a little soldering, there is actually a bulb that when Radio Shack was still a thing in this country, you could go there and you could get a bulb and you could actually replace these. Takes a little surgery, and you've got to have fine motor skills and some good eyesight. So for the older audience here, that might not be your cup of tea. The same goes for the outside temperature display. I don't even know, I doubt you can even get those anymore as a complete unit. I do have a spare sitting downstairs. I could probably look up the part number if anybody's desperate to try to hunt for one. But I will say that there is also a typical Radio Shack hack for that, where you could take it apart, replace the bulb, and you're back in business and you can see it once again. And unfortunately, mine has burned out in this car, so I would need to do that modification if I could find the bulb. So that's a little bit lower on the priority list, especially in this car, which I don't drive this one very often, but worth mentioning. And finally, we're going to talk interior leather and interior condition in general. Rear loop headrests in particular are really prone to splitting. I'm trying to get this, you can see where that is a little wider here. It is splitting on the edge. Obviously the sun cooks these and they expand. And even though I condition this car frequently with, it's been Lexoled to death over the years. Even though I do that, you do the rear loops, they still tend to split after a certain amount of time. There's just no way around it. If you can keep it out of the sun, that's great. The fronts are not so bad, obviously. The rears just get baked in the sun. But definitely take care of your leather, if it's in good shape, clean it up really good. I use some detail brushes and Lexol cleaner, and you can get it into kind of a frothy little foam, and then wipe it off with microfibers, get it really clean, and then condition the daylights out of it. And I actually condition these seats in this car, generally speaking, on a monthly basis. And so you can see they're still, this car has 209,000 miles. It's a 93. It was daily driven for years. It's got a little bit of bolster wear there, but not too bad. And a lot of that just comes down to being very meticulous about taking care of it. I've actually started using CarPro Pearl on these for the lasting effects, just to see how well it holds up. It does, you can kind of dilute it to your liking, so you can have it shiny, and I don't like it super shiny. It's a little bit shinier than I would need, but you can dilute it down a little bit more, and I like the fact that it has UV protection as part of it. So I've been testing that, you know, on the door panels and things, and just keep it clean, keep it conditioned, both the vinyl and the leather. So historically I'd used Vinyl X on the vinyl, which of course has gone out of production now, so I'm hunting for the replacement. And I've used 303, and I will not use 303 anymore. I did that for 1 year on the Pearl car, and I developed a crack in my dash during the 1 year that I was using 303 meticulously, like I had with Vinyl X. So not a fan of 303 at all, but I've got Chemical Guys VRP, vinyl rubber plastic, that I've been testing, and it's okay. But so far I've been really liking the CarPro Pearl, so I've been using that under the hood on the hoses, which that's another thing. I put an old sock, like cut off sock on my hand, put the protectant on the inside of your hand, and then just go around wiping down all of the hoses all the way around. And that is one reason the engine looks so clean and well kept. These hoses are all, they've been basically protected with Vinyl X for many, many years, and now they have CarPro Pearl on them. So same goes for the rain tray and strut tower covers, everything that's plastic or vinyl or rubber, CarPro Pearl now on this car. It's not cheap, but you do get to, it comes concentrated, so you dilute it into your own spray bottle and go from there. All right, I think that's good enough for this particular video, but we'll be back for some more. And sagging headliners. This is something that on my cars has just started happening within the last 3 years, and it is incredibly annoying. In order to take these out, you either remove the front windshield, which, given the fact that the glass is not super easy to find for these, plan accordingly if that's your plan. Otherwise, if I remember correctly, I removed the front seats and the rear seat lower, and then also the rear passenger door panel. And then I could actually get this, I could drop the headliner down. Of course, you have to remove the pillars. It's a lot of work to take this down. So, and it would sneak out the back passenger door, if I remember correctly, from when I did it. I parted a car out years ago. So you have that, and it's really common to see some sagging headliners on these. And really the only way to fix it properly is to, if you're going to reuse this material, would be to take it out, take the material off, or roll it up very carefully, clean all the foam backing off because it just falls apart with the adhesive. And then you're going to basically put new adhesive and foam on there and reassemble everything. It seems simple enough, but in my eyes, it's best left for the experts because it's not something that you want to do often. So you want someone that really knows their stuff to redo your headliner for you. And I think at this point, you know, I'm going to do mine at some point, probably not this summer, but the goal is to switch to Alcantara on this, and also with the A-pillars as well. So when that time comes, yeah, kind of not looking forward to that, but it's somewhat inevitable in these cars as they get older. Next up, I would say cruise control inoperable. It's something that's pretty common on these cars, and yet it's also fairly simple to fix on a lot of them, because in many cases it basically is, there's a switch down on the pedals up underneath the dash. So if you follow that up, if you follow the arm up here, when you depress the pedals, there's a series of vacuum switches up there, and it can be the switch itself that fails and starts leaking, or it can simply be out of adjustment. I mean, I've seen some where that switch is actually just kind of free floating back there and it's not making contact with anything. So check there. But then there's also, you know, under the hood, there's some vacuum lines. But most of the time, it's, in my case, I've had just a couple of switches at the pedals be the culprit for the cruise control issues. So if your cruise doesn't work, take a close look at those vacuum switches, and if you search within the Quattro World FAQ area, you'll find a troubleshooting guide for this, I believe. So I won't go in depth here, but if somebody wants to, if you're a visual learner and need me to do a separate video on just that, we can do that at a later date. Just leave me a comment. Next, we go to the rear of the car and we talk about the rear calipers, and specifically it's the e-brakes and the e-brake cables. If you live in the Rust Belt especially, they're really prone to seizing on these calipers, and so they'll stick, and you'll pull the e-brake handle and you will not be able to release the cable, and then you'll have to fiddle around under the car in order to reach the release spring, which is not really easily visible here, but let's see if I can catch a glimpse here. Right there in the middle of the screen, that's where your e-brake cable attaches. So basically, if you get a new set of calipers, I would encourage you to right away coat every part of them in POR 15 high temp, which is the silver. This actually has red POR 15 caliper paint over that, but these are 20 years old and they actually just started sticking last year. So if you can get a hold of them early and coat them so that they don't start rusting, you'll do yourself a favor. Okay, under the hood, I will say the number one thing would be, in terms of drivability, boost leaks. As you drive, you get into throttle and you get a sudden buck or cut, and a lot of times that is related to the factory hoses having issues, whether it be the intake hose here starting to fail. Those actually typically fail right down by the turbocharger here. They get oily and they start to fall apart. So this one here is from BONNET. I believe it is probably bulletproof. That is one of the hardest hoses I've ever experienced in terms of the material feel and installation. The fact that it does not flex makes it a bit of a challenge. You also have the bypass valve, which down there you can see the billet valve on this particular car, but the typical valve, if you shift gears and you hear it flutter like a rally car, your bypass is probably blown. I know it sounds cool, but it's not ideal, so you want to fix that. Also, you have the hose from the intercooler into the intake here. These are, they generally last pretty well on the stock hose as long as you're not, crazily modified. The ones that do fail all the time are what we call the Michelin hose, and they are buried on the underside of the car. So if you take the belly pan off and look under, basically under this headlight, there is a hose going this way that connects to the crossover pipe from the turbo if your car is still running that stock setup. And those get oil in them. It's pretty common to take that off and find some oil in it. But they just weaken up and they fail. And at this point now, where these Samco hoses have been on these cars for many years, I'm actually starting to see the Samco hoses starting to fail. So you've got a couple of options out there still for replacement silicone hoses. One, if you're in the S-CAR Preservation Society, at the time of me posting this, I believe Assam Abed up in Canada was working on a set That might be coolant hoses, come to think of it. But yeah, I know there's like OBX, and there's a few different brands that are still floating around out there. But since I mentioned coolant hoses, the stock coolant hoses also start to fail, and these are somewhat difficult to find factory. I believe they're probably the 3 favorite letters from Audi USA and LA. But this is a G+ silicone replacement, and I've done several of them on this particular car. I mean, back, I think just mainly this, but I know on the white car I've done more of those hoses as well. I do have one down there on the aluminum thermostat housing, which, touching on the hardening of these cars in order to make them more reliable, if your car still has a plastic thermostat housing, which you can see beyond right down in there, do yourself a favor and get an aluminum, or if you can find the older metal unit from the factory Audi ones. But I know EFI sells these aluminum bits. Get that, and then also there is, at the back of the head, there's a little T-valve down here, which I'm going to see if I can get you a view of. But there's a, let me get on that. You can see the sensor. I've got the light on here. It's really back center. My stupid, let's see if I can get a focus on that. But right down in there, there is a T-valve in there with that temp sensor. Those are factory from the plastic from the factory. Do yourself a favor, get the billet aluminum one, because those do crack, and you'll dump a lot of coolant, and you'll be sitting on the side of the road waiting for a flatbed. So do it now, as they say. The other spot is going to be at the back of the head here. There's another very common failure point. As I look down here, you can see that hose coming out at the bottom there with the billet flange. Those are also plastic from the factory. Replaced that yesterday if it was just still plastic. They do fail, and it dumps coolant at an alarming rate when they do. And then finally, if I go back to this side and look under the intake manifold, and I did a separate video on this, but there's a hose. You can see that little section of blue hose in there. There's a section of 2 hard lines. It's a short little section, but that hose will develop a pinhole leak usually, or sometimes it'll just burst. But definitely replace that. It's out of sight, out of mind for so many people. And like I said, I did a separate video just on that particular hose that shows what hose I use as a replacement, etc. So do that one, and that's primarily it. You may at some point experience a failure of the afterrun coolant pump here, which I have the lights on right down here. That particular part, there we go. A lot of times they fail in the ends. They just start puking out the end of that pump. And I honestly haven't looked lately to see if those are still available. I think maybe some people were using B5 pumps. But if there's someone out there that knows for sure on that one, you can leave a comment. But I have had this one fail. Ironically, just as I pulled into a driveway, it proceeded to puke coolant everywhere. So those are a few of the things that you'll want to do to have your car as reliable as possible. And the one final thing I'll just really quickly touch on would be the ignition setup. And you can see here I'm running the LS coils from EFI Express. Very simple conversion process, gets rid of the stock coils, allows me to run I've got MagnaCore wires on this car. I've got the more standard wires in the Pearl car, but I run that system on both cars simply because you can find those LS coils everywhere. I mean, you can be in the middle of Podunk and walk into a Napa store and get a replacement coil. So I usually carry one in the trunk just in case. I've yet to have any failure of those coils as well, and they seem to work well on this car, which is RS2 spec, which you know, obviously a little more demanding than stock, but not too crazy. Now we'll talk about rust. And these cars do rust, especially down at the bottom of the fenders in the front, places along the doors, especially along these moldings here. For some reason, I see more S6s with their revised molding style develop more rust on the lower doors here. Also in the rear of the car, if you look underneath here, so up where the license plate lights are, they tend to develop some rust spots there, so keep an eye on that. But generally speaking, you know, these cars were galvanized from the factory, and so they tend not to rust unless they've been neglected. You know, I mean, if you drive it in salt all the time and never wash it, it's not good. And then also, if they've been in an accident and repaired, so you basically lose that galvanization. Maybe it's an aftermarket panel that gets put on the car. Maybe they've just ground it down to bare metal and they've, you know, quickly fixed it. For whatever reason, that tends to be a problem. On the cars that have been properly repaired or painted years ago, I know this particular Pearl car has had paint quite some time ago, like long before we had bought the car, and it's been doing all right in terms of rust, as has this car. I mean, this has had a little bit of paint here and there over the years, I think from the previous owner, but rust is generally not a problem. I will say on the S6s, more so, the edge of the hood on those cars would sometimes rust, more so than on the S4s from what I've seen. So keep an eye on that. Obviously, you know, you can look at the frame rails down in there on each side, and then also underneath the rear bumper. If you look up at the frame rail from underneath the car on each side, you'll want to see what the rust is like down there. And let's see, I can't really get under there very well, but trust me, they're up there. Just make sure, like, you know, surface rust is fine, but if they're full of holes and, you know, if it looks like Swiss cheese, then you've got a problem on your hands. So keep mind of that. Honorable mention: the in-armrest phones no longer work. As cool as they are, yeah, you can't get service for these anymore. So they're basically pointless, but they look cool. And your passenger can ride around, or you can ride around flexing like it's the 80s or 90s. I will say that I have used one of these when they were functional back in the day, and you can see the microphone pickup up here. When you had the factory radio installed, it would mute the music. It was a voice-activated phone, so it would actually mute your radio, and you could say, if I remember correctly, I could say, like, call home, and it would place the call, and then it would just come out of the stereo, you know, the sound system speakers, be hands-free. It was a full 3-watt analog phone, so even in those days when you didn't have as many cell phone towers, you were a lot less likely to drop calls. They would get a little staticky, but you would jump to the next tower and it would continue on. So it was a really cool thing. And, you know, now we have these little 1/2 watt, you know, digital phones, which, you know, calls have gotten decent, I guess, with those. But in the early days when they switched to digital, I had a lot more dropped calls, and I was really wishing that this phone still worked. But of course, the downside of an analog phone is you get your number cloned quite often, especially if you go to a major metro area, as I discovered while traveling back in the day with my cell phone. So little extra for what it's worth right there. Oh, and I know I don't say this very often, but please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll keep making more. Also, leave comments on what you would like to see in future videos, or I feel silly saying episodes. I'm not a TV star. I've got a face for radio. But there you go. Leave comments, and I will do what I can. Thanks for watching.